This video was made possible by our friends over at class-central.com/Pakman. Click the link under this video to get access to thousands of lectures from the world's top universities, many of which are totally free. Whether you realize it or not, you might believe in some of the superstitions I'm going to discuss with you today. We could define superstitions as irrational beliefs that an object or behavior has the power to influence an outcome where there's no logical connection between them. Very often people believe superstitions for underlying sort of pseudoscientific reasons, but there's also evidence that suggests superstitious behavior is found among all sorts of species, and it might even have been evolutionarily beneficial. In 1947, famed psychologist B.F. Skinner performed an experiment which would later become known as the superstition experiment, where he put hungry pigeons under supervision and had them machine-fed at regular time intervals. And over time, 75% of the pigeons started to exhibit sort of ritualistic behavior, like they believed whatever action they took before the feeding might have caused the feeding to take place. And this was the first experiment to suggest that it's not just humans that have tendencies towards superstitious type behavior. Evolutionary psychologists suggest that superstitious behavior is an inevitable feature of adaptive behavior and that every organism could be subject to it. And they've theorized that superstitious behavior usually has little downside, and the intuition behind it might help survival in a few different ways. So the suggestion is that being slightly superstitious is almost a natural part of life for many species, and in fact, sometimes it could have benefits. Psychologists at the University of Cologne in Germany found in a recent study that good luck charms can improve performance. Though the good luck of these rituals and objects is likely confirmation bias, you remember when it works and attribute it to the superstition. When it doesn't work, you attribute it to something else. Superstitions can also lead to a false sense of security, and that's been observed in a study of South African taxi drivers. Superstition in drivers was positively related to the number of accidents that they had been involved in. But instead of looking at the value of a good luck charm or of taxi drivers in South Africa, I'm going to focus in this episode on some of society's most colloquial and common superstitions. So fear of the number 13, 666, walking under a ladder, breaking a mirror, opening an umbrella inside, black cats, spilling salt, saying God bless you, wishbones, crossing your fingers, and knocking on wood. So let's get right into it. The number 13 has special significance in our culture, so much so that fear of the number 13 has its own name, triskaidekaphobia. Hotels often have no 13th floor. I guess that's not really true. They have no floor that they call the 13th. There's still a floor above the 12th, no matter what you call it, but they don't have a floor numbered 13. Airports tend not to have gate number 13. Friday the 13th is easily the most superstitious day of the year. And like many of these superstitions, it's not exactly clear where our aversion to the number 13 comes from, but there are a few different ideas. One possibility is that there were originally 12 people with Jesus at the Last Supper. Judas was the 13th disciple to join Jesus that night, and soon after he would go on to betray Jesus. In the ancient Persian religion of Zoroastrianism, the number 13 has been considered sinister and wicked for thousands of years. It's also been said that there were 13 steps to the gallows, 12 going up and 1 going down. Thomas Fernstler, who works in the Math and Science Education Research Center at the University of Delaware, says that 13 has this awful place in our collective imaginations simply because it comes after 12. 12 is a perfect number mathematically and historically significant. The 12 gods of Olympus, 12 months of the year, 12 hours of the clock, 12 tribes of Israel, 12 apostles of Jesus. It's all arbitrary, but there are these numbers in human history. But is there actually any power in the number 13? Seems extremely unlikely that 13 holds any significance outside the one we presuppose it to have. In a few cultures, it's even thought of as bringing luck, not misfortune. 666 is a highly stigmatized number in culture, similar to 13 in its mystique. 666 is connected to the Bible, specifically the New Testament's book of Revelation. It refers to the number or name of a wild beast whose relation with Satan and the Antichrist is sort of unclear, who's the harbinger of the biblically foretold end times. Rings a bell based on some of the interviews we've done. It's not totally clear what exactly 666 refers to. Is it the name of the beast? Is it a number associated with the length of the beast's reign on earth? Or is it a cryptic message to persecuted Christians living in the Roman Empire? As usual, there is not a clear answer from the Bible. The number of the beast is given in Revelation 13:15 to 18. This part of the Bible was likely written during the reign of Nero, the Roman emperor. And when looking at his translated name in Hebrew, the letters, which in Hebrew can also have numeric values, add up to 666. So this sort of hints at the possibility that this passage was code to Christians at the time, telling them that the Roman emperor, and therefore the whole state by extension, was under a demonic antichrist influence. People often caution others about walking under ladders. It's a smart policy to be extra alert around ladders, regardless of good or bad luck, because someone might be on the ladder. But walking under it, according to some superstition, has dangers associated with it beyond just the risk of immediately getting hurt. And I'm referring, of course, to the idea that walking underneath a ladder causes bad luck. In ancient Egypt, priests would sometimes leave ladders in tombs because it was believed that spirits could use them to ascend upwards. In the Middle Ages, people began to associate ladders with the gallows. So to walk underneath one could have been to foreshadow your imminent death by hanging. There's also a third explanation, which is the Christian concept of Trinity. Walking under a ladder disrupts the natural Trinity associated with the shape, which I guess would somehow curse you. Mirrors in the past were usually very small and very expensive. And building a cultural taboo around breaking them is almost sensible in the sense that in populations where mirrors were so rare and scarce, maybe the superstition about breaking mirrors was about saving money because they cost so much. Mirrors are no longer so rare, but yet the superstition still remains. There is this ancient belief that projections of your physical self contain a piece of your soul. So if you shatter a mirror, it could be believed that you shattered a part of your soul in the process. But of course, this superstition assumes that, number one, souls are real. Number two, that they can be in multiple places at once. And number three, that they could somehow be trapped within a reflective surface, even though mirrors are flat and have no depth whatsoever. So once again, seems a little bit far-fetched. When it's raining outside, people will often mention it's unlucky to open umbrellas if you're still in the house or indoors. One explanation for this superstition comes from ancient Egypt, where umbrellas were used only by the elite, but not so much for rain, but to shield themselves from the sun. To open an umbrella inside, then, was an insult to the Egyptian god of the sun, Ra. But there's actually a more sort of grounded explanation for the umbrella superstition, and it comes from 18th century England. This was the first time period where umbrellas became widely available, but they were made with very sharp metal spokes and frames, which would very rapidly expand when opened. This made it actually a potentially dangerous and volatile action to open an umbrella indoors in terms of the risk that it would place other people and objects at, and maybe that's the source of it. A very common superstition all throughout Western culture, and especially noticeable around Halloween, is the idea that black cats are an ill omen. Black cat hysteria is so bad that around Halloween, many animal shelters won't allow anybody to adopt black cats because they fear that the adopters will mistreat them around Halloween. Medieval Europe was a place where superstition was very plentiful, since there was very little education available to much of the population. And this was a period during which witch hunts were not unheard of. I'm not talking about investigating the president for possible illegal coordination with a foreign country. I'm talking about actual witch hunts. And relatedly, the idea that black cats were associated with the occult also started then. Cats are known as nocturnal. People started to associate them with the devil as a result. And the superstition grew so intense that people actually undertook mass purges of black cats in Europe. Let's talk about salt. Salt has been, for a very long time, a really important food item. It's used for flavor, it's used for preservation. It's been very valuable throughout history. And a common superstition that surrounds salt is that spilling it is an omen of misfortune. And the best way to counter this is to throw a pinch of salt over your left shoulder. In an age where salt was rare and very valuable, it makes sense that norms would develop around its use. Given its value, if you spilled some, you were throwing a lot of money away, which would feel like bad luck. The other theory about this superstition's origin actually comes from Leonardo da Vinci and his famous painting of the Last Supper, because in the picture, we can see that Judas, the man who would go on to betray Jesus to the Romans, had spilled salt, relating to one of the most reviled men in history. With spilling salt may have helped to spread the news that spilling salt is an evil portent. It's practically a reflex for many. When you hear someone sneeze, you hear "God bless you" or some version of it. For many people, it's just good manners, but the origins of the expression are very, very firmly rooted in superstition. One theory is that people used to think that a sneeze was an attempt by the soul to escape the body. So if you bless the person who sneezed, you're protecting their exposed soul from the devil, who might try to steal it in a moment of opportunity. There's another theory that comes from the time when Europe was being ravaged by plague. Sneezing was thought to be one of the first symptoms. So in 590 CE, Pope Gregory I ordered that those who sneezed be blessed immediately. I don't know if you have this tradition at your house, but around Thanksgiving, it's a common practice to remove the wishbone from a turkey before you carve it. Once dried, two people make a wish, pull the bone from either side, and whoever has the bone break in their direction supposedly has their wish granted. This is a tradition believed to have been inherited from the Romans, who got it from an Italian people they conquered in antiquity, the Etruscans, who believed that chickens were oracles who predicted the future. Chickens would often be sacrificed by the Romans and the Etruscans. Their remains were searched by priests for clues as to what the future held, and how this morphed into being about turkeys and only the wishbone isn't completely clear. But what is clear is that the power to grant the desires of a Thanksgiving guest is definitely not something that the turkey's version of a clavicle bone would accomplish. Next, let's talk about knocking on wood. Very common expression, common action, to knock on wood after potentially jinxing something. The action of knocking on wood keeps away bad luck. In pre-Christian Europe, people worshipped spirits, some of whom made their homes in the trees. And to pray to these gods, and often to ask for their favor, people would lay their hands on the trees to communicate. In Christian communities, there's a belief that by touching wood, you're also somehow touching the wood of the cross, and therefore you're seeking the protection of God. There's one more explanation about knocking on wood, and it comes from British folklorist Steve Roud, who claims that a 19th century children's game known as Tiggy Touch Wood is the progenitor to knocking on wood. The game functioned much like modern tag, except it was trees that were the only safe zone. Superstitions are all around us. For many of us, their use in conversation comes so naturally that we hardly even notice them. These superstitions, some of which are even considered rude not to adhere to, come from pre-modern understandings of the world. When you don't have science to sort pattern from noise, people's brains jump to all sorts of conclusions to explain what seems unexplainable. Today, we know more about the universe than ever before. We know that someone who sneezes isn't having their soul leave their body. We know that breaking a mirror is mostly a headache to clean up rather than anything else. And walking under a ladder won't actually have any effect on your life. Many people take what's called a Pascal's wager approach towards superstition, like those we've talked about. And what I mean by that is, even though it's really unlikely that superstition would come true or be real, people choose to believe it just in case that it's worth something if it doesn't take a lot of effort. Economists estimate that every Friday the 13th, millions of dollars are lost in business and productivity. Some superstitious Christians might refuse to pay a bill if the total is reminiscent to the number of the beast. When we let superstitions guide our decisions, we surrender our ability to think critically, even though we know all of these things to be True, superstitions still remain. Maybe B.F. Skinner was right, and every creature who survives by spotting patterns spots some, even when they don't exist. But as the only animal with the capacity for intelligent thought, maybe it's time we move past the realm of superstition and instead start to see the world for what it is, not the imaginary patterns that superstition suggests. If you're interested in evolutionary psychology, the kind that plays a big role in the development of superstition, and you want to find out more, I would recommend taking a free online course offered by Kyoto University called Origins of the Human Mind. It's only one of tens of thousands offered at class-central.com/Pakman. You can click the link under this video, start watching courses from the most prestigious universities in the world, including Harvard, MIT, Stanford, Berkeley, Oxford, and hundreds of others. They've got classes on politics, philosophy, psychology, business, just about any type of class you'd be able to take at an actual university. Check it out. Click the link in the description to search for a class on a topic that fascinates you. That is class-central.com/PAKMAN.